So now let's look at some things that can influence value. And some of these things you might not really think would have anything to do with an appraisal. But I will tell you, there are just a lot of things that could absolutely influence value, either in a positive way or a negative way. And let's just look at what some of these influences might be. Well, one, we have to consider social forces. And this is dealing with things like birth rates, death rates, marriage rates, divorce rates. And you might think, well, what does that have to do with property value? Well, I will tell you, if any of these things get skewed, if any of these numbers start getting skewed one way or another, it could absolutely have an impact on value. If you see, for example, in a particular neighborhood, an incredibly high percentage of, say, married couples are now all of a sudden getting divorced. You might wonder what's going on here. That might have an impact on how bad you might want to live in this same neighborhood. Or if you see that there were a lot of deaths in this neighborhood for whatever reason, a high percentage of people dying, that could have a pretty significant impact on how many might want to live in this neighborhood. So social forces certainly will play a role in value. But then we also obviously have to consider the economic forces. How's the economy doing? Obviously the economy is a huge deal, probably in any industry, but certainly with real estate. If inflation is high, which we've been dealing with quite a bit, at least as of the time of this video, that could cause issues when you look at buying a house. Things just cost too much. So we might have to wait for inflation to start coming down. Maybe the unemployment rate is high. Maybe you just can't get a job in this area. So if you're in an area where there are just no jobs, that's going to affect how many people can buy. If you don't have any buyers, that affects the supply and demand. That's going to certainly have a huge effect on value. Maybe I can get a job. Maybe I can find a job, but it's going to be 30, 40 miles or more from where the property is I'm looking at buying. Well, that's going to affect how much I'd be willing to pay for that property, right? If I got to drive an hour each way to work and back. So obviously the economy is going to play a large role in value. We have to consider political forces. What's the government doing or not doing? And does that have a negative impact or a positive impact, whatever it is they're doing? Things like eminent domain. Hopefully you recall and remember what eminent domain is. It's the right the government has to take private property for public use. But if they're going to take that property, then what are they going to do with it? And then how's that going to impact the property around that area? Again, will it be positive or will it be negative? So those kind of things have to be considered. We have to consider physical forces. Is this primarily a high income area or primarily a low income area? Is it primarily owner occupied or is it primarily tenant occupied? All of those things will have an impact on value. There's no question about it. So you got to consider those things. But then we talk about these market cycles, which I think in the previous session we already kind of touched on this. But every market, throughout the country will go through what we call market cycles, where the market will be up one moment and the next moment they're going back down again. It's just the way things go. Now, the nice thing about real estate, at least from history, history tells us that even when real estate takes a downturn, value starts going down, it always comes back up. And when it goes back up, it typically always goes up higher than what it was before it started going back down. So y'all, over the long run, y'all, real estate is an excellent investment, right? There's just like anything else, there's going to be the ups and downs, but it tends to keep going up higher and higher and higher over periods of time. So it makes it a very good investment. But going back to, but what creates or causes these cycles? Well, that's going to depend on your market, and y'all, different markets have different cycles and different reasons, or different things create these cycles. Probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest, reason for some of these market cycles we talked about earlier were the schools, right? Spring comes around, that's when school's getting ready to let out. You start seeing prices ticking up. Summertime, school is out. That's when you see the sales prices peak, and so forth. So you need to understand the market cycles in whatever market you're in, and that will help you anticipate, we talked about earlier, to anticipate what market value is going to be doing in the near future, right? A lot of this is just going to come from experience. The longer you practice real estate, the more you're involved with it, the more you're going to learn, and again, through experience. And then the last thing we want to talk about right here in this session, is dealing with federally related appraisal work. What they're talking about here, there are certain types of real estate transactions that are obviously considered federal transactions that would not require an appraisal before before a lender can loan the money. Now, what I want you to be careful of here, and don't misunderstand what I'm saying. Even though there are some federal transactions, or federally related transactions rather, that do not require an appraisal, that does not mean the lender can't require it because of their in-house policies or what have you. In fact, my guess is, the lender is going to require, more times than not, they're going to require an appraisal, especially if you're buying property, okay? But depending on that type of transaction, it may not be required by the government, basically is what we're saying here. So there are some federally regulated transactions that do not require an appraisal, and we're going to take a look at those real quick. And the first one says loans with a value less than $400,000 would not require an appraisal. Business loans less than $1 million would not require an appraisal. But this third one here, it says refinance with the same institution with no advancement of monies. I will tell you, that one's very common. If you're refinancing, or in some cases maybe even taking out a HELOC, home equity line of credit, home equity loan, you're getting it with the same lender. That lender may very well not require another appraisal, depending on the equity that you have in the home, and how much you're trying to refinance or cash out, right? But you see that a lot, where they may not require an appraisal at all for something like that. If it's an FHA or a VA loan, it's not required. Again, appraisal is not required. Or loans that qualify for Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. And, we haven't talked about Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac yet. I wouldn't even worry about it, honestly, at this point. But actually, in the next chapter, we're going to be talking about financing. And we'll talk more about Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and there are others. But, these are considered secondary mortgage markets. These are really government entities that are involved with the financing, lending process. Again, we'll talk more about that in the next chapter. But again, what we're trying to get you to see here is, there are some real estate transactions that do not require an appraisal. Now, does that mean the lender is not going to require you to have an appraisal? No, y'all, the lender is probably going to require it because of their in-house policies. It's just they're not forced to do the appraisal by the government. So, with all that said, yeah, I suspect there's a good chance they'll ask you a question about this. The question would probably, which of the following real estate transactions would not require an appraisal? And obviously any one of those could be an option, but I would be willing to bet you if you get that question, the answer they're going to be looking for is the very first one. Loans with a value less than $400,000. So certainly be familiar with all of them. But I would absolutely remember, loans less than $400,000 do not require an appraisal. Again, that does not mean the lender's not going, doesn't mean the lender won't require it. This means the federal government will not require it. Okay?